Rocks and throw rocks. They used to stone them back in Jesus' time, but I don't think they do that anymore. Okay, if you guys all want to get a seat and everything, we'll get started here. So, Everybody get settled in. So I'm real pleased this morning to be able to introduce a speaker that was willing to come down from Seattle, Washington and speak at 6 o'clock in the morning his time. This gentleman really doesn't need a whole lot of introduction. He's about one of the most popular astrologers in the country right now. He is a full-time professional, as I said, from Seattle, and we're real happy to have Jeff Green here this morning, and his lecture is going to be on Pluto, the Evolutionary Journey of the Soul.
Thank you. Good morning. Awake and ready? Yes. Good. Okay, first, for those who have studied the Pluto book that was written on this here topic, this is going to be a workshop in which you can ask me the questions you may have that has come out of that book. So the bottom line is that during a workshop you can ask me anything you want concerning the material that we cover today, as well as, as you're reading the book going, hey, what's this mean? So you can ask me, and don't be shy from asking those questions. I mean, most of us in America have been conditioned to be shy and or timid. So don't do that, because it's really your time. I mean, I've covered this material long enough over many years, and so it's really your time, eh? So what this material deals with is that question that many people ask: why am I here, and what are my lessons? For those that are doing counseling astrology, you will have noticed over the last 4 to 5 years that there has been an increase in the clientele that has been asking these questions. Many people are becoming socially alienated because the existing social structure is beginning to collapse. So all the mythologies and social models that many people have bought into aren't working. So more and more people are asking these questions. And so from an astrological point of view, there is a way to answer it. And that's exactly what this material is for. Because what these questions imply are the evolutionary nature of our life. And at a deeper level, life to life. Now when you deal with this issue of reincarnation, or life to life, or the progressive journey of the soul, or the transmigration of the soul, whatever you want to call it, please remember it's only been in the last few centuries in the West that this natural law has been doubted and or questioned. Even today, 2/3 of the planet, the population, still has such a belief structure. It has been the most prevailing belief structure throughout history. So if you want to talk about something that can be classified as a norm, who do you think really is in the minority? But the great thing is that, in other words, if you're conformity orientated, why not conform to this norm? You understand my point? So the great news is that you don't have to take it on belief either. It can in fact be proven. How? Let's take a nature of a word that exists in all language. All languages. And let's just focus on one word called growth. A word describes a process or a phenomenon. So, the bottom line, if we only have one life, if it's just one time around, why grow? For what purpose? What's the intent? Why would people feel that they have something that they learn behind any given experience? For what purpose? So my point is that words describe process. What process are we describing? In addition, when you deal with the nature of the soul, because most of us have been exposed to this word, it exists again in many languages, many races, over vast amounts of time. But what in reality is a soul? Can we give it a descriptive quality? Again, a word describes something. It describes some sort of phenomenon. So what is this word soul describing? Just to put us on common footing, let's perhaps try to agree on a simple definition. Let's try and call it an immutable consciousness. Immutable meaning it cannot be destroyed. That has its own inherent individualized structure. i.e. a soul has a structure. That has its own eternal identity. An example of this phenomenon would be Seth. i.e. Seth speaking through an entity named James Roberts. Who's doing the speaking? Seth. From a soul point of view. Meaning that soul has that name. In effect, you have a egocentric structure within the soul itself. That's its own word, is it not? Ego. That of itself describes the phenomena, does it not? And we have all grown up in a culture, at least within the last 20 years or so, in which for those who have attempted to spiritualize, you have learned this thought to get rid of your ego. Well, for those that have struggled, you find out it's not possible. So what does that mean? I mean, we can't surgically open the brain and remove the ego. You can't even find it. You can't find thought, nor can you find consciousness. And yet it exists. For those that studied, excuse me, but you know, the early part of the lecture I'll probably just ramble here because it is 6 in the morning for me. So if you don't mind digressions. But you know, the Buddhists have a happy little saying called the causeless cause, or the formless form. If you really want to understand the nature of this truth, meditate on the nature of thought. It exists, but you can't find it. You can't open the brain and drag out a thought. So clearly it's a formless form. But anyway, the ego, what is it? Let's just use the happy analogy of a movie projector. And imagine now that you have a film thing, reel of film. And you've got a screen. If you don't have a lens, are you going to see the images on the film? Similarly, the ego of the soul and the personality that it manifests are focusing agents within consciousness. From a purely energy point of view, it's a vortex that creates an image of oneself and is necessary. It cannot be removed. It's an inherent structure of consciousness. Even if you take your greatest of the great, the Jesuses, the Moseses, the Buddhas, they could not even utter their own name, without an egocentric structure to create the name. So the issue is not getting rid of the ego, so to speak. It's ultimately, the issue metaphysically is to align it, unify it with a higher will and or higher ego, and you can call that God. This is the true meaning of those words, getting rid of the ego, in a sense of just identifying with it subjectively. So really what you have here is a mistranslation from Eastern literature to West. So the soul has an inherent structure, it's an immutable consciousness, it has its own identity. And it cannot be destroyed. Now, we can ask the following big question. Why was the soul created? In the first place. And who created it? What created it? And for what purpose? And this is where you start getting into the nature of religions, don't you? Oh, God. So, we'll leave that for you to ponder. What we do know is that it exists. Now, the only thing I would say about that, especially for you Virgos, just meditate on the nature and origin of imperfection. The origin. Meaning, if you accept the belief that what you call God or the source created everything, wherein lies the origin of imperfection. The point here is that if the Creator was perfect in the beginning, there would be no need to create.
Your logo is stuttering.
Die! This is not working. Oh well.
All this meditating on imperfection,
I guess so. Overload the circuits or something. So my point is that if that what is called the Creator is perfect in the beginning, there would be no need to create anything. But also try and keep in mind this following fact, and which is the basis of evolution, by the way. The interface between imperfection and perfection. And again, I ask you the question, wherein lies the origin of this issue? It exists because it exists. We can observe it, we feel it, we experience it. That cannot be doubted. So my big metaphysical question to you and myself is, wherein lies the origin of this issue? Because it always exists. After your body dies and mine dies, it still exists. It exists in the next person, the next person, the next person. But try and remember that, if we use the analogy, let's use, imagine now, water. And let's, if I pour water into this cup, is not that water going to reflect the nature and structure of this cup versus the inherentness of the totality of the water? Similarly, when you take the phenomena of consciousness and you pour it into the inherent structure of human consciousness, it can only understand the truth that that consciousness is capable of understanding, that reflects it. That's why you have all these personified images of God and the goddess, reflecting human form. But my point to you is this: what if we lived on some planet in the Pleiades? And the nature of creation there relative to consciousness was different. Would not their pantheon of God and goddesses reflect that? Or do you think it's going to reflect our image? So, do you understand my point? So, if we deal with the nature of the soul, what you have relative to this interface between perfection and imperfection is the linkage to desire. Desire. The desire to perfect. The desire to be perfect. The desire to eliminate imperfection. / growth. / evolution. We can all, again, don't take this on faith, we can prove it right now. Is it not true? Because look, the evolution of the soul in the end is based on the elimination, the progressive elimination of imperfect / separating desires. Separating from what? That which created the soul, whatever that may be. And so you have this inner dynamic in the soul, one desire to separate, one desire to return, which is, in fact, the basis of what a psychologist would call free choice, and or what an esoterist will call karma, meaning that which you desire must translate into an action. And relative to Newton's observation of gravity, cause and effect, you have a reaction, which is equal or proportionate to the action. This we can see. So, to prove it, is it not true that any of us can have whatever separating desire, the new sofa, the new lover, the new position, and we might have the ability to obtain what we desire, and we might have a temporary sense of satisfaction, eh? But what replaces it? Is it not dissatisfaction? The sense of something more? Yes or no? Yes. This is a perfect empirical proving of this simple law. It's not their hypothesis, you've just validated it yourself through your life, as all peoples have for all time. So, you have the nature then of the evolution of the soul, the progressive elimination of separating desire. Is the very basis of Buddha's enlightenment underneath the Bodhi tree, as he pondered the nature of sorrow, misery, pain. His conclusion, desire, was the basis of. If you just take a look at the nature of our world now, and you focus upon the nature of separating desire, now manifesting through the subjective ego, now that Pluto's in Scorpio. Don't you see, just as a simple example, because this transit now is squaring the Pluto and Leo people. And this is the generation that has now become the yuppies. Scorpio. And what you have there is, I'm going to get mine, Leo, while I can, Scorpio. You understand my point? And of course, a lot of these folks back in the 60s were the hippies. So what kind of metamorphosis? Scorpio. Does this imply from a hippie lifestyle value system, thank you, to a yuppie? You see my point? So, the nature of the soul is to evolve through time-space. And there are two kinds of evolution that, again, we can empirically prove and observe. There is cataclysmic evolution, as in an earthquake, a volcano, Watergate, Iran Gate, Pluto transiting Venus. No. Or the slow yet progressive evolution, as in Darwin's notion of uniformity, the theory of uniformity. Cataclysmic evolution occurs for two reasons. Either through personal or collective resistance to what is needed, evolutionarily speaking, from the point of view of change. And in effect, resisting necessary change. The reason that what would be the basis of the resistance? What for? The Pluto question is why? Because that's what constitutes one's immediate reality, individually or collectively, is formulated from that which has come before, the past, which has led to this moment even as we're speaking. And thus security. It's a known quantity. It is familiar. I can control it. I know it. One of the central components to security in all human consciousness is the need for self-consistency. Thus, when your self-consistency is challenged, your security is challenged. If my immediate reality that I know and can control is challenged, I feel insecure. Thus I resist. If I resist for too long, relative to necessary change, cataclysm. The deeper force is not your resistance, it's evolutionary necessity. It's the principle of water returning to the sea. It will get there. So just as Nixon tried to resist what was happening around him, keeping in mind he has a 10th house Pluto, which was the resistance based on? It happened anyway, relative to evolutionary necessity. And keeping in mind that Watergate exactly happened when Pluto was transiting Nixon's south node, the past, coming to a head. Coincidence, synchronicity. Then you have, of course, a non-cataclysmic change, which is simply slow, progressive evolution. One thing evolving to another thing over a great amount of time. Now, oh, the other reason, by the way, for cataclysm, sorry, I'm spaced, is a result of karma, meaning some prior action equaling a reaction which is either happening now or has been deferred and is happening now. In other words, if I go out and kill somebody now, it's not fated that I myself get killed now. It can happen later, can it not? That's a deferred reaction. These are, again, things that just happen. It's life. It's not theory or hypothesis. My point is, how do you explain it? You all awake and ready? Is it too heavy or what?
I had a question.
Yes, sir.
I got stuck as I was trying to ponder this on one question. The cataclysmic aspect of that is involved in evolution is caused by a resistance to necessary change.
Yeah.
I perceive the soul as resisting change, as threatening a sense of annihilation through its sense of its own structure, its own nature. And if the soul wants to survive in its current structure, what causes its resistance to the annihilation of its form?
Oops. Thanks a lot. First of all, the structure of the soul will always survive.
But not in its form. Because
The form of the soul is constant.
now that's where I have to grasp that if I don't get it.
Well, it's based on the ultimate evolutionary journey of the soul is to return or merge or unify with that which created it.
I thought the soul was expressive of a particularized form of individuality.
No, the ego is. That's what you're mixing soul with ego / personality.
Okay.
The soul simply generates and or creates a personality that it needs. It's like a coat over a body. Generates a personality that it needs to accomplish its evolutionary intent in whatever life. Each personality is oriented to the universal in its own unique way. Thus its interpretation and experience of that reality is unique to itself. It's a classic example of something happening, 10 people observing it and having 10 interpretations of the same phenomenon. Personality. That's what changes.
Would the soul be more a sense of incompleteness that is striving to complete and heal itself then through taking on certain ego characteristics to fulfill it in that incarnation, in an evolutionary kind of pattern?
I got lost in that question there.
Well, I sense if the soul doesn't have any characteristics of individual identity in a sense, that's more of an ego, but the soul is an immortal, that doesn't add anything to the concept here, but if the soul has no particularized characteristics to it, but it's a more amorphous type of thing, and as I grasp the concept of soul, that it's an attempt at closure and completion of energy, and that the characteristics of the particular phase of this incarnation combines with an ego of a particular form in order to help the soul's closing and making more integrity for itself.
Well, it's got nothing to do with closure or integrity. It simply has everything to do with the fact that the soul did not generate itself. It did not create itself. It was created by another force. This is, in fact, the very origin of the Christian concept of original sin. The original sense of separation. What did I do wrong? And thus the origin of the guilt trip.
Well, the soul, as I see it, continues. If one of the fundamental characteristics of the soul is its persistence, then why is the soul persisting except for a sense of unfulfillment and a motivation of...
Because it comes back to this point of the past equaling the moment equaling security. We are talking about experience through time and space. The soul is a consciousness. It's immutable. It has memories like personality has memory. It gets used to being separate. And keeping in mind that the soul has not created itself in the first place. Of itself, it's imperfect. So if it's already had a series of lives over many, many centuries, generating experiences, memories, orientations, awarenesses, it gets used to it. If I get used to wearing the coat on my body that's making me warm, am I going to take it off? Nah. Wait. We have to... What?
My question is on the same.
What?
My question is on the same.
Go ahead.
Well, then, if you come into this present incarnation with this soul that has all kinds of past experiences,
Yeah.
you are carrying the past experiences with you into this present incarnation. How does this reflect or work with the ego?
It becomes the very basis of establishing that ego. All that which has come before is every bit of it, contributes to the totality of your personality that the soul makes this time. Because that past, future, and the interface in each moment will be reflected consciously in the personality. How many of us are conscious of the soul?
The past lives of our soul?
Just the nature of it. To have your consciousness, the center of gravity of your consciousness, the point of awareness of your consciousness, centered in the soul.
You never thought of it that way.
Well, that's why you have mystical traditions. That's the nature of meditation. To do just that. And to break the over-identification with just a personality in this life. So what you have, most of us can be aware of the soul by its effects, not the awareness of its causes. That's what is generating a particular motive, desire, intention, and so on. But we are aware of the effect. And that's how we can, in a echo-like way.
What makes us aware of the effect? The past,
Your life.
the present life.
Yes, if I have Pluto transiting my Venus, and I'm starting to experience the effect of my relationship degenerating, I'm aware of that effect. Am I not? Wherein is the origin of its cause? My soul is needing to grow, metamorphosize, and I'm experiencing limitations now, which is really to say limitations in myself. But I'm now projecting Venus through my relationship. I'm aware of this effect. Now, you see my point?
Now that's your ego. That's the
The ego is conscious of that reality. Yeah.
First, this is like, we're playing with belief systems, but when you talked about God creating a spirit, I can't even phrase it right, but I guess what I want to say is God creates because God creates. That's his nature. And resistance is what causes us problems. We have a dilemma to we stop creating when we resist, or we create resistance.
Mm-hmm.
But you were talking about the interface between perfection and imperfection.
Yeah.
And God could never be perfect because that would be a static.
Not true.
Static.
What is called God itself evolves.
Right. Yeah, okay. So then all the soul does is take abstract thought and we live it. We manifest in physical realities to live out concepts that to the soul are unlivable.
No. No, because I understand where you're at. I mean, you're having a conflict between the natural order and all kinds of conditional thought sequences reflecting what is apparently called truth. And my point is, the whole nature of the soul and what your dilemma ultimately reflects is the need to unify with natural order, natural truth, not abstract. Because in the end, what you see, the natural order is very simple. It's what people call truth. In the end, the truth of the creation is incredibly simple. It's only when you start studying each particular point of creation that complexity occurs, which is the interface between Pisces Virgo. We are living now in the Virgo sub-age of the Piscean age. That's why you've had this incredible acceleration in technology and science and being able to look through the microscope to the point of seeing non-matter. Even the physicists have reached a point in their microscopes to where they can look so deeply into the nature of matter and or energy that there's no more cause. So that they themselves are making these statements, the causeless cause. Well, Buddhists said that, 4,000 years ago. So what you have here is the interface between the inner microscope, Pisces, and the Virgo microscope, and they're reflecting the same truth. But my point is that in the end, Pisces, it's simple. And it's only when you study the part within the total creation that you have complexity. And it's when you focus on the part that you make these abstracts. So, one more, yeah?
Do you have an explanation of why the source individuates the soul? Perhaps you're going to...
Why the source created anything? It comes back to this point of imperfection. Beyond that, I don't know. Who could?
Well, this is my question. Do you?
Well, that comes back to my point of the water in the cup. Because only so much the consciousness and the human structure can grasp. And there is that which is not graspable and or knowable from the point of view of human consciousness. And so that the nature of the biggest question is unknowable with respect to, so all you can do is describe phenomena and experience phenomena, and that which exists.
So there's something that is just accepted then.
To a limited extent, yes, it's true. But what you're accepting is the obvious.
But there is a why.
Huh?
Why?
The big why? That's like saying what's the origin of the Big Bang.
Wasn't the Buddha able to merge his consciousness? Wasn't that the point? To merge the consciousness with the wider consciousness?
Well, it's true.
Why, in a sense, the ego and the personal ego is not disappeared, but it's shifted into another gear, and you tune in with the other.
Yes, but look, even Buddha made that statement, that there's only so much that human consciousness can know even after it's merged. And in the end, the essence of Buddha's teachings, if it comes down to one word, is suchness. What is suchness? Oh, let's go on. So, we can measure this dynamic, i.e. the soul, it's this dual desire nature, the interface between the past, the future, and the moment, and the birth chart. It comes back to the original question, why am I here, what are my lessons? Because again, those imply evolutionary intent. So, the Pluto position and the natal chart, individually speaking, correlates to what the past has been for that particular individual. What kinds of desires have been in operation prior to this manifestation, to this life? What constitutes familiar memories and or experiences that the soul automatically gravitates to in this life? See, now you can speak about it even non-metaphysically, because the natal position of Pluto is now going to correlate to what psychologists call emotional complexes, and or in what you've learned about compulsions or obsessions, and or the nature of defensiveness and or vindictiveness. Or because what am I defending? In that defense, can I not be angry if that which is threatening my reality is making me feel threatened? What am I threatened about? So the point is that from a non-metaphysical point of view, the Pluto position correlates to the source of the deepest unconscious security in any of us. And unconscious is the very basis of what becomes the basis of complexes or compulsions or obsessions. And because they emanate motives or desire in which the very nature of it, you cannot understand its cause. You can't, it's emanating from an unconscious realm. You're aware of effect. As an example, what if I have Pluto in opposition Mars and we're dealing with somebody who has this pattern? Pluto opposition Mars and yet maybe trining Mercury. And let's say that this person has a compulsion, an overwhelming desire to experience sexual things that are outside the status quo, which we could now call sexual taboo. Pluto opposition Mars. And as person in their consciousness becomes aware of these desires coming into their consciousness, that they now feel Pluto compelled to follow. And yet they're trying out to Mercury, mentally they're going, I don't want to do this. And yet the nature of the compulsion is emotional, Pluto, and thus more powerful than the mental intent to override it. We're aware of the effect. Wherein lies the awareness of the cause. You see my point now? So, sources of deepest unconscious security that we all gravitate to without even knowing it. It's most natural to the order and law and evolutionary station of the soul at this point in time, this life. And yet if relied upon, if the soul, the individual, the ego that has been created just stays there, then you have the observed phenomena of stagnation, and or now the word non-growth. The soul has stopped the evolutionary sequence. Thus you set up the basis of cataclysmic event. You see my point? So we can describe this phenomena for each of us. Each individual house position of Pluto describes this for each person. Where you have been, where you come in at, what you gravitate to, and yet simultaneously what the current evolutionary intent is in order to effect continuing evolution. That evolutionary intent is not in that natal position of Pluto. It is in the opposite house and sign. We are living in the land of cause, effect, and duality. Light, day, male, female, and all this. Polarities. So with respect to evolution, the polarity point reflects the evolutionary intent this time, which will occur with or without your conscious cooperation. Just as Nixon experienced Watergate, the polarity point for his 10th house Pluto, 4th house. He had to utterly generate and create an entirely different self-image, 4th house. And thus an entirely different experiences generating security. Something other than that 10th house Pluto, i.e. career, president. Now he was himself, did he not make the statement, I am president? And in one of his famous lying speeches. What is implied there? That the I structure, the ego structure, is utterly integrated to the social function. 10th house. To the extent that the sense of self-concept and security, familiarity, self-consistency, is now Pluto overly identified with it, overly invested, Pluto, to the extent that personal evolutionary growth is denied. So what is the polarity point here? He had to learn how to see himself without social position. You see my point? I mean, clearly the phenomenon of Watergate would have driven him deeply in on himself, no? Which would have to examine the nature of who he is. And thus, hopefully, reformulate himself. Guess who has South Node in Scorpio? Your friend Ronnie. And guess when Iran Gate happened? Pluto transit. And guess where that South Node is? Me and Jansky did I realize this chart is quite controversial, but me and Jansky, when he was still alive, we did a rectification thing, and we came up with 4-degree Sagittarius rising, which makes it a third house Aquarius Sun, and the South Node's in the 12th house in Scorpio. Now, all of you have heard in the papers, or read in the papers, the Teflon president. Does this not describe a South Node in Scorpio in the 12th house? My point, look at the nature of Iran Gate. You see, what was the basis of it? Was it not a covert something or other? Was it not based on illusions and delusions and lies? And this is a way to validate these things. Most of you have read in papers that one of his main criticisms is that he's not aware of details. He could care less. Well, his North Node's in the 6th house. A lesson. It also reflects the lesson of humility. Well, Pluto comes along, guess what happens? So anyway, the current evolutionary intent is described by opposite house and sign for all of us. And it will happen with or without your cooperation. The water will return to the sea. Obviously, if you are developing awareness of what you're trying to accomplish and you cooperate with it, then you can hopefully minimize any potential cataclysmic event, unless it is karmically determined relative to prior action. And this is the basis of what you now call fate. From a generational point of view, obviously millions of people are going to have Pluto in the same sign. Pluto Leo, Pluto Virgo, etc. What you're looking at here is that it takes a whole bunch of people to effect the planetary evolutionary needs. No one person can do it for the planet, unless you're a highfalutin type. So an example, keeping in mind the law of polarity. A bunch of us in the room here have Pluto and Leo. So, as a generation, all of our individual souls in that generational grouping orientate to this Leonian dynamic as a primary orientation, i.e. the emphasis upon creative self-actualization and the self-generating right to have the freedom to do so. Thank you. But it's not the polarity point for the generation. Aquarius. Is it any coincidence that as this generation comes into more and more positions of power, socially speaking, is it any coincidence between this fact and the fact that we're evolving into the Aquarian age? Is this synchronicity or coincidence? Similarly, Jesus himself, for those who remember, I am a Sagittarius like Rob, and we do have to have fun sometimes. This Pluto was in Virgo. He himself said that he was here to usher in a new age, now known as the Piscean age. Well, polarity point, Pisces. For him. Coincidence or synchronicity? You see my point here? nodes, yes, in Cancer, Capricorn. And Venus and Aries in the 8th house, squaring not only the nodal axis, but the Pluto that's now conjunct that south node in Cancer. So what you have here relative to skipped steps, or that which was not finished, was a gender issue. Meaning the first part of the individual's life, it had to finish being a male. And yet, because the primary intent was to be female, you could see the signature there, yes? The nodal axis, the Pluto, polarity points, the sign. That finally had to manifest 8th house as an operation, in which the gender was being metamorphosized, 8th house, through surgery. And then the person becoming Venus and Aries, 10th house Pluto, a leader, a champion of this particular cause. You see the equation here? Yes or no? Who's confused?
Yes.
In other words, there's yet another phenomena. How's it explained? So the bottom line is that when you look at this as an astrologer / counselor, you want to create a consistent mode of operation for their life so that they can have stability and consistency, while at the same time accomplishing and fulfilling the evolutionary intent, which on the one hand is to recover the skipped steps so that the current evolutionary intent can operate and manifest uninhibited. So in this case, you want to determine the node that Pluto is applying to. Keeping in motion here that the nodes mean motion is retrograde. So the simple way to look at it, the node that last formed a conjunction with Pluto will be the node that Pluto is applying to, whether that's the north or south. That becomes the area, house, sign, to be consistently developed, orientated to, the foundation. So that the polarity point of Pluto, the experiences correlating with the north node by house and sign, they're going to be developed, no doubt. And yet the point of reference, the point, the place to come from, so to speak, will be the south, the node that Pluto applies to. Then you create consistency.
Are you considering Pluto's motion relative to a static node? In the chart, if you're applying Pluto to a node, is the node point static and the Pluto motion applying?
A birth moment is a frozen moment in time.
Is that how you're...
Yes, sure. It's a snapshot in time.
But you could apply the node to Pluto or Pluto to the node, whichever station
You want, well, to determine motion means what? It means what's the slowest moving body in our solar system. Okay. So, again, from a client and counseling point of view, it is not uncommon to have such clients. In many cases, especially nowadays, the astrological counselor is becoming a counselor of last resort, because many people have found that the traditional ways of counseling aren't working. And this, because most of the time the traditional Western psychological model is based on consensus behavioral applications. Thus the basis of the ink blot test and the like, / behavioral modification. Whereas the counseling astrologer, in most cases, is able to determine the individual lao of each person that is in front of it. And now that for those who are concerned with looking at life evolutionarily and seeing this in the chart, karmically is in the chart, and this type of client comes to you with a planet or Pluto squaring the nodal axis, how in the world can the ink blot test reflect a planet squaring the nodal axis? Do you see my point? I mean, they might simply reduce it to the narrowness of the idea of neurosis or neurotic behavior. But can they tell that person why? No. We have drugs for this now, right? To control the extremes. So, just point clear to you. You can also measure how much an individual is attempting to accomplish in any life, i.e. how much work, what rate of evolution are they responding to. This is simply determined by the aspects that Pluto makes to other planetary bodies. This in effect determines the evolutionary pace. I think most of us would agree that there would probably be an observational difference between an individual who has Pluto relatively less aspected to planets than one perhaps who had Pluto aspecting everything. Not only in terms of their life experience, but the very nature of the energy that they reflect within themselves. Yes or no?
Yes.
And you make these statements without judgment. It's neither here better or worse for this one to have more aspects than this one. For those that really get into the evolutionary nature of aspects, you can also determine at what stage of evolution any two archetypical dynamics are. For an example, if I have, let's say, Pluto 5 degree Leo, could not a square exist between Venus if Venus itself was at 0 Scorpio through, let's say, 10 degrees Scorpio? Yes or no? Yes. Now, there is going to be a mathematical difference relative to orb. Is there not? What this symbolizes and suggests, archetypically, is the evolutionary difference. In other words, it's going to be, if I just come into a life and I have Pluto square Venus, and it's prior to an absolute aspect, an absolute square, is there not going to be, in all likelihood, a difference in my response to that Pluto-Venus square versus Pluto being square Venus and at the maximum orb of separation of that square? It's sort of analogous to going into a department store and buying a pair of pants. Do they feel like yours in the beginning? No, they feel foreign. They're not yours. And yet the longer you wear them, what happens? Similarly, if Pluto-Venus is in a new square aspect, I'm not used to it. And thus my response reaction to it can be different than if I've lived with that very same aspect over a number of lifetimes. You see my point here? This is important because then you adjust your language and approach to the client who reflects these things. There would be a difference in the Pluto square Venus in a first quarter state, first quarter square, and the person who has Pluto square Venus in a last quarter square, evolutionarily speaking. You're talking about the nature of cycles here, which Rob will be talking about in his workshop today. So I just want to mention this point so that you look at it. You also have to account for the phenomena of Pluto retrograde. Clearly, Pluto is retrograde about half the year in any year. So generally this means that half the people on the planet all the time have Pluto retrograde. What does it mean? It means generally half the people all the time aren't buying into it. No matter what their evolutionary state is. The point being that the retrograde archetype correlates with the dynamic of individualization, the need to individualize, the need to withdraw, to retreat from the status quo expectation of how the behavior associated with the planet is expected to operate from a consensus point of view. In other words, if I have Venus retrograde, society, this one tells me how to be in relationship. All kinds of stereotypical cultural models, yes or no? But if I have Venus retrograde, what? It means no, I will question for myself and determine my own relationship model, which is now going to be different than the status quo or any kind of external expectation. Does it a retrograde symbol actually accelerates the evolutionary nature of the soul because it begins the individualization process. So if I have Pluto retrograde, is it not suggestive of the groupings of souls who are retreating or rebelling or in some way questioning the status quo of whatever, and thus allows the human species to evolve? It accelerates from an esoteric point of view, places more emphasis upon the desire to return to the source of the soul. Although 90% of the individuals who have Pluto retrograde will not conceptualize it this way. It will emphasize in that 90% the sense of dissatisfaction. And there's that sense of dissatisfaction that correlates to the questioning that goes on. The need to do things differently. You see this point here? Yes. That's why, when you look at it collectively, the collective soul, when Pluto goes retrograde, it gives us actually an opportunity to not only reflect upon that which has come prior to its going retrograde, I'll give you an example in a minute, but also allows you to adjust your response to that which has come before, so that when it goes direct, that response will be more perfectly aligned with the intent in the first place. Let me give you an example. The north and south, well, how many are familiar with Jondro's work, Edward Jondro? This is a work that I would suggest many of you check out. He was dealing with what he called geodetic equivalence, wherein the celestial positions of the planets could correlate to the terrestrial longitude-latitude lines of Earth. So, an example. The United States. Its south and north nodes, of course, in Aquarius and Leo. The degree of the north node in Leo for the U.S. correlates longitudinally, is that how you say it? to Hiroshima. Now, when the atom bomb was developed, and keeping in mind that the original inventor was a man named Oppenheimer, whose primary deity was the goddess Kali. And for those who have studied Indian things, well, death, destruction, rebirth. And see, from Oppenheimer's point of view, he generated the atom bomb. Why? He felt that there was a weapon made that was so powerful, there would be no more war. What he failed to realize was the human imperfections that took over and have made it what it is today. But nonetheless, when the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and so on, Pluto was transiting U.S. North Node. Is this coincidence or synchronicity? And now, in this most recent time, the transit of Pluto has been squaring the nodal axis of the U.S. chart. The first square specifically correlated with the summit in Iceland, in which Gorbachev, who is a Pisces, by the way, how many are aware that he's just been poisoned? Within his own country, somebody's trying to kill this man. He's just had massive food poisoning. He was on vacation, ate some food. He's okay. But this means that somebody within his own structure, as they did with Kennedy, killed him, tried to kill him, because they're trying to advocate peace. And they're trying to defuse the military-industrial complex. But anyway, Iceland correlated with this Pluto transit, the U.S. And what was the message there? Absolute disarmament. So my point is that relative to the first Pluto conjunction, the U.S. North Node, through time, becoming a square to that nodal axis. What does it mean? It means at that point in time that the world, the U.S., the USSR, have an opportunity to eliminate Pluto, be away, get rid of this insanity called nuclear weapons, which of course most of you know Pluto correlates with fission, or the nucleus of anything, / atom bomb, neutron bomb and all this. And look at the message there. And the South Node was in Aquarius, is in Aquarius, the unexpected message. You see my point here? And didn't they describe it somewhat this way? Unexpected? Nobody was anticipating? Catching Reagan again, yet with his pants down. / unprepared. Is he ever? We'll leave these jokes aside now. But then Pluto goes retrograde, you see my point? Because what was the initial reaction? Everybody freaks out, we can't do this, and all the things that these types of consciousness do. Threat to NATO and all these claims. Asking Reagan to eliminate the delusion of Star Wars. I mean, this is an aside here. Reagan South Node Scorpio 12th house. Is this not a perfect symbol for Star Wars? Think about it. Space-based defense. And doesn't Reagan himself claim this to be his greatest dream? The ultimate insurance? Are these not descriptive of South Node and Scorpio in 12th house? Yes or no? So my point is that, sure, there was an initial objection relative to existing reality, security. But as this thing went retrograde and so on and so forth, there were times to reflect on it, thus to adjust it. And what has now led to this, hopefully, this initial agreement of these short-range, middle-range weapons. That's a beginning. You see my point here? So Pluto offers these kinds of opportunities. And this is why when we go through a Pluto transit, it can take a lot longer than one would suspect. Because it's direct, retrograde, direct, retrograde. The minimum amount of time that you have to deal with it, 18 months. The maximum 5 years. For those that remember Watergate, it was exactly 18 months with respect to the actual crunch time. And that correlated with the Pluto transit on Nixon's South Node. Again, coincidence, synchronicity. And in Nixon's case, his South Node is in Libra, so he took down all of his yes men with him. All those Libra alter egos. The Ehrlichmans, the Haldermans. And you see with this contra thing, Reagan's South Node is South Node Scorpio. Well, the rule is Pluto. In Reagan's case, that Pluto is in the 7th house. Does this not describe Nancy? Yes or no? So, are these points clear? Now, when we go through, let's put it this way, there are 4 ways that Pluto instigates or effects its evolutionary intensity, or intention. 4 ways, 2 of which are cataclysmic, 2 of which are non-cataclysmic. The first way and the most common way. Is to form a relationship with something that symbolizes to you that which you think you need, which at that point in time you do not currently have. And by forming a relationship to it, a Plutonian osmosis takes place in which you become that which you have formed the relationship to, thus metamorphosizing.
Could you repeat that, please?
Huh? Oh, the question is, would we repeat that? The most common way for Pluto to effect its evolutionary intentions is to form a relationship to something. An example would be astrology. To something that you think that you need, which at that point in time you don't feel you have. You form a relationship, Plutonian osmosis takes place, metamorphosis. There was a point in time in this life in which you became interested in astrology. All of you. And all of you formed a relationship to astrology, yes or no?
Yeah.
And as you immersed yourself in your studies, did you not notice an osmosing taking place? Yes or no? Did this not then add to you that which you were add to you what you were not before. Did this not generate some sort of metamorphosis? This is a non-cataclysmic way of doing it.
So from a layman's point of view, you are what you think you are? Or you become what you think you can become?
At an egocentric level, you are what your experiences create.
Okay.
If I study astrology, I become an astrologer. Another most common way to do this type of evolution is to form a relationship with the lover. Is it not true that when we form an intimate relationship with somebody, we are confronting, Pluto, our existing limitations, Pluto? Yes or no? And as we decide to commit, Pluto, to a particular person, is this not implying some sort of Pluto merging? Yes or no? Through the merging, are we not osmosing? We osmose them to us and vice versa. Yes or no? In which a mutation or metamorphosis takes place. You see my point? A very empirical example of this is sex. You become sexually united with somebody, and when the sperm and ovum unite, osmosis, metamorphosis, child. Again, the law of Trinity. This is in fact, from a esoteric point of view / karmic point of view, one of the greatest arguments for not being sexually promiscuous. Not for just at the juicy point, no. Yeah, I guess. Because you see, Pluto correlates with the RNA DNA structure, the genetic code, from a purely anatomical point of view. So when we are sexual with somebody, the sexual fluids are exchanged, are they not? Through osmosis, we take on or become the karmic signature, evolutionary signature of that which we sexually united with, and vice versa. And thus we can alter our own life path in some way. Is it not true that for those that you have slept with, that they are more firmly embedded in you than those that you have not? Is this not true? Sort of. What's that say? No. So anyway, this is my argument anyway, for not being sexually promiscuous, unless you want to, take that path. This has nothing to do with all these moral claims of, that all the fundamentalists are now making with respect to the age signatures and all the rest of it. The fact is that Pluto and Scorpio in the 8th house all correlate with the phenomena of viruses and bacteria. They are just forms of life. And as you come into the Scorpio time, Pluto, Scorpio, you have mutation. So what is mutating? Forms of life called viruses and bacteria. They are directly mutating in response to when Pluto was in Virgo, i.e., when all the super vaccines and all these high-powered drugs were made. These are forms of life. They're trying to sustain themselves. as any form of life does. And thus they mutate and become these types of bacteria and viruses that, as when they originally manifest, create problem. And so now it's called AIDS. But to attach any kind of moral, religious view, you see my point? This is sheer insanity. Anyway, this is one of the ways that Pluto affects, i.e. the form relationship. And the point here is that, you can form a relationship to anything to effect metamorphosis of existing limitations. It can be studying astrology. It can be studying the stock market. It can be forming a relationship. It can be sexuality. The point being that the highest evolutionary form of sexual expression, which is a Plutonian issue, is not just base primary sexual expression that, let's say, Betty Crocker and Marlboro Man do, and or Rambo. No, the English word from the East is called Tantra, in which the actual energy exchange is rerouted up the spine. Pluto correlates with the spine. Pluto correlates with Kundalini. To reroute it, not to dissipate it externally. And this simply involves certain ancient / timeless. Just because something's ancient doesn't mean it's outworn its time, because replace ancient in certain cases with timeless or eternal. It allows, once the routing is reversed, a mutation in consciousness. The point being that when Kundalini, are you interested in these things? I feel like I'm rambling here. Demonstration. When Pluto is released, i.e. Kundalini, from the root chakra, it will attempt to Pluto penetrate to the nucleus Pluto of any cell that needs to be alchemically changed. You put two chemicals together, cell, Kundalini, alchemical metamorphosis. That will actually change the nature of not only your entire cellular structure, but the consciousness that inhabits that structure. Consciousness exists. And it is only through the egocentric desire of separation that you think your consciousness is centered just at this point in time from this point of view, radiating around you. But when you effect a alchemical metamorphosis of the cellular structure of your consciousness within the brain, there is a phrase in Sanskrit called center everywhere, circumference nowhere. And this is what happens in the consciousness. When the physicists finally made all these high-powered things, the astrophysicists, the telescopes, they finally arrived at the following conclusion, that wherever they look within the universal structures, center everywhere, circumference nowhere. Reflecting again yet another ancient truth. For those that have been studying chakra and the various universal dimensions that they correlate to, the astrophysical model is called black holes. If you are talking with a physicist, ask them to explain to you the nature of a black hole. they can sort of vaguely describe it as, I think I heard one guy describe it as violations violations of physical laws making space operate in a strange way. Something like this. Which is really saying they don't know what the hell it is.
You can ask them to try to describe magnetism, they'll have a hard time.
Exactly.
That's something they know, they can see all kinds of proofs and describe what it does, but what is it?
Sure. So, another way that Pluto instigates or affects evolution is to, at certain points in evolutionary development, is to isolate Pluto upon some inner and or outer dynamic that is generating a sense, increasing sense of stagnation and non-growth. The initial state of consciousness when this happens is aware that it is stagnating, not aware of the cause. Again, the interface between, in quotes, consciousness, unconscious. Because the individual at this evolutionary point, the soul, intends to change, it simply can lead into a progressive withdrawal or isolation from their immediate and existing reality. The consciousness, the psychology, the soul is trying to become aware of the cause. Thus the isolation and increasing immobility. The maximum state of this condition equals catatonia. Again, a phenomena. How is this explained? A classic case of this one, the great German philosopher Nietzsche. How many have studied Nietzsche's philosophy? Most of you are aware that the last days of his life was spent in a catatonic state. Astrologically, Nietzsche, 4th house Pluto, South Node in Virgo in 9th house. Here you see a classic example of initiating a new philosophic cycle involving romantic philosophies that had a new cosmological model of existence. In his time, his philosophy was not accepted. As he became older, he did not know why. He felt persecuted, criticized, attacked, misunderstood. Virgo, which of itself progressively degenerated into emotional isolation, retreat, and withdrawal. He didn't know why. In addition, because of the gender switch that is implied here, he did not sleep with his first woman until he was in the mid-50s. The very first woman that he slept with, he got syphilis. South Node in Virgo, a disease. Which obviously contributed, because there was no treatment then, to this catatonic withdrawal. The point becomes, until the individual becomes aware, consciously aware of the cause of the isolation, the withdrawal, and it effects corrective strategies, allowing for the new growth to take place. This state can degenerate in worse forms to catatonia. Believe me, this one condition can generate a hell of a lot of problems. Take an example, let's say we deal with a banker who is now 42 years old, operated out of certain values, certain belief structures for X amount of time, establishing a family, it's got the mortgaged house, perhaps the Porsche. And then goes through this type of Plutonian event, promoting a progressive withdrawal Is this not going to create probable havoc within the wife, the children, the banking community, his job? As he withdraws and finds less and less meaning in these things, what happens to the mortgage house? You see my point here? These things happen. Recent case example, the fellow who had been a Mormon, this is a guy in Seattle, been a Mormon all these years, married, done a Mormon cosmology thing, all the children, the whole thing that Mormons do. That's well, you know, Mormons are people. But he reached this point, and he couldn't do it. And he, over roughly 18 months, progressively withdrew from the wife, the children, the Mormonism. Began to ask bigger questions. Yes, the man had a 9th house Pluto. And yet the very nature of the questions that he was asking violated Mormon cosmology. Thus the wife started making statements, "You're going to hell." And so on. In the end, the man ended up being a drifter, sleeping off the beach in Malibu. Simply now in an existential state of consciousness, which was the immediate metamorphic leap from the Mormonism. You see the point here? So this can create real problems, and would not to be taken lightly. So this is clearly, in potential, a cataclysmic event. Another way that Pluto affects these things, these evolutionary intentions, which is now non-cataclysmic. That at key points in one's evolutionary journey, the soul will release into consciousness latent capacity. Latent capacity. Which, when actualized, creates a metamorphic transformation. A classic case in point would be when Carter decided to be president. Carter has 12th house Sun in Libra, 9th house Pluto. When he decided to be president, to run for it, Pluto was transiting in the Sun, releasing capacity, which then altered his life course. What did he have to do to become president? You see my point here? And all the circumstances he had to set in motion, and so on. And the last way, which is cataclysmic, is the forced removal from something in your life, whether that's an inner dynamic or an external condition, that you have overly invested and or identified yourself with, to the point that you are no longer growing. And again, the case of Watergate. And this is simply now removed in one way or another. Wherein lies the origin, because all of us over time have experienced this condition, not just, it doesn't have to be limited to this life. This is the origin. This particular situation is the origin of the Plutonian fear of loss and the Plutonian fear of abandonment, which is the origin of the Plutonian dynamic of suspicion, and or the origin of the Plutonian dynamic of prove it to me. Do you see my point? It's the origin of mistrust. It's the origin of manipulation in order to feel secure. It's the origin of power tripping or power dynamics in a relationship, and so on. Just that one phenomenon. Yes, ma'am.
Could you relate these 4 ways of change to any particular Pluto transit?
No, because these are 4 ways that it inherently exist, and they manifest relative to each individual nature.
But I mean, when these things come about, do they correspond in any way to a Pluto transit?
Well, either a Pluto transit or what the soul has programmed for its entire life. As an example, if I deal with an 8th house Pluto person, in general, this is a soul that is programmed throughout its life. A series of metamorphic events leading to massive disruptions, and yet redefinition, stability, metamorphosis, throughout the life.
Okay, so the timing has really very little to do.
The timing has everything to do with it, but it's not specific to the Pluto transit.
Okay, that's just what I was going to say.
What if I have Pluto in the 8th house and all of a sudden Saturn transit is in the 4th house aspect in the natal? Yeah. And in any case, Pluto will be involved in some way. Okay. So these are the 4 ways, eh? Now you have to, when you look at the transiting Pluto, what you read is the transiting needs or intentions of the soul. Not only individually, but collectively. Now that we have Pluto in Scorpio, what is the collective need of the soul and the collective need of the planet that these souls are living on? This is a very dynamic time. Anything manifests or has meaning relative to context. The existing context of our times in U.S. is a capitalistic economic structure within a democratic and/or freedom of right type of political system. When you put the 2 things together, because ever since Uranus has been in Scorpio, it's accelerated this phenomenon, you have this, just amongst many issues, you have the issue of the emerging corporations. And again, another example of osmosis leading to greater things, in quotes. But now that you have Neptune in Capricorn, you have this phenomenon of multinational corporations based on merging. Now, in the political structure that gives such people / corporations, they are in essence, believe it or not, people, the right to do this. My question becomes, with respect to Pluto and Scorpio, what happens if the existing phenomena of these multinational corporations continues to buy up the economic infrastructures of local communities and/or countries, and you remove local power to make decisions reflecting the reality of their situation? What happens? What happens when you continue to have an overinflation of the stock market? Stocks being printed just like paper money, not reflecting actual corporate reality, but to make more money. You see my point? And so on. The point that I want to make, because I'm not going to go into a political route, is that the polarity point of Scorpio is Taurus. And one of the archetypes of Taurus is the instinct to survive within the species. This is why it correlates with the procreational instinct. Taurus does. So, relative to collective choices, Scorpio, that the collective souls make is not, in the end, survival issues on the line. Yes or no? Not only the survival of people, but the planet itself. That's how important this time is. And it's doubly so because of the existence of nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear technology. It's for that one reason that this time in human history is the most important, at least with respect to the current world cycle, or yuga, if you want. You understand my point? So please believe that all these doomsday scenarios that you hear, they're not fated. They're not destined to happen as if we have no choice in the matter. But everything depends on the choices we all make. This is why this next conjunction we have, Saturn-Uranus, next year, is so important. Because it happens to take place in the center of galaxy. So does this not suggest that the political leaders that we opt to elect, ought they not to be a centrist type of person? One who can incorporate all views? Or should we elect yet another extremist, whose vision is unity and sameness, the delusion of Neptune and Capricorn, versus the enlightened unity and diversity? You understand my point? So for those that have any sort of impact on human beings around you, to the extent that you feel inclined to be politically involved, perhaps just one message to those that are responsive to you. It doesn't matter what the political labels are, Republican, Democrat, it's stupid. But what does matter is a centrist. Does this make sense, or am I bumping gum again? Okay, now, as you could probably deduce, we could go on and on, but since we have about 20 minutes or so, and many of you approached me during the break, what I'd like to do is open this up for your questions and or examples, and we'll go on from there. Yes, ma'am?
I have Pluto and the North Node both in the 8th house. How does that axis work one place to the second?
Yeah, Pluto conjunct the North Node in the 8th?
They're not conjunct, but they're both in the, is that just the same as you were talking about, as if they were conjunct, or is there a difference?
Yes, because keep in mind you can have two kinds of conjunctions. You can have a new phase conjunction. Well, the question was, she has Pluto in the 8th house, North Node's there, but they're not conjunct. So what does it mean? Keep in mind that you can have two kinds of conjunctions. You can have a new phase conjunction or a balsamic. So right away you want to determine, is this node moving towards Pluto and or away? You see my point? That's the first thing you determine, because that determines how you interpret the meaning of that south node. What it means is that if the North Node is moving towards the Pluto, that means that you're progressively moving towards this area of concentration, 8th house, through which your entire life will be funneled, and that it's becoming closer like this. You see my point? Whereas if that North Node is moving away, it means you've already done that, and that you've become too limited in so doing, and that time is over, and that you're moving away from this. You see my point? And now beginning to reopen from that base of power into brand new experiences. Back here.
I have a Pluto Mercury opposition, which is in conjunct the nodes, with North Node being conjunct Pluto. Do I just completely discount the Mercury conjunct the South Node?
Of course not. Why would you even make that conclusion?
Because you said that the North Node conjunct Pluto would be the whole thing through which your life is running.
That was when just Pluto was on the North Node. We didn't say when there was a planet on the South. No, because that Mercury on the South Node comes under these three conditions that we described when Pluto was conjunct the South Node. Remember? Fruition, relive, maybe both.
They're all tied into a grand trine with Pluto making it a kite formation.
It would tend to suggest more of a fruition state, just based on that aspect pattern. So that means you're bringing something from the past into this life that is involving Mercury South Node issues. And that becomes a central component to your overall structure of reality, North Node Pluto, this life. You see my point? Okay.
bit about the North Node being in Scorpio?
Talk a little bit about Mercury. No, North Node being in Scorpio. What do you want to know? What it tends to mean in general. I mean, it's, you know, we start talking, it's like cookbook stuff, you know. But from archetypical point of view, it tends to mean, generally, that the South Node in Taurus is very analogous to a frog in a well. And sitting in the bottom of its well, it sees that much sky. That's what it can control. That's what makes it feel secure. That's why Taurus can have some inertia, or laziness, or stubbornness, or what is called stodginess, because that is the whale. The role of the North Node in Scorpio is to promote confrontations that force that frog from the well, and thus to expose it to the entire horizon, not the limitation of the well. So in general, you have a soul that is programmed confrontations throughout its life that initially it won't understand, and yet progressively cooperate with as it begins to understand why. So it can be a very potent symbol for a fundamental alchemical metamorphosis, leading from one type of life in the beginning to an entirely different type of life later on, in the context of the same life. It tends to make a soul that is programmed two lives in one, so to speak. You understand my point? I'm sure you do. Hey! Back here.
When you're involved in one of these relationships that you're talking about with an instrument of change in your life, then you get to the point where you actually should realize that it is either something you're too attached to, it's outlived, and yet it's a situation where you're either going back together, breaking apart, and there's an awareness there, but at what point do you recognize? What point can you say, make the break, I've had enough, I've made my changes?
When you perceive that no, oh, repeat that? You gotta be kidding. Essentially what she's saying is that she finds herself in a relationship that comes and goes, and at what point do you make the break? What point do you find that this is enough? Is that the fair way to... And the answer is when you perceive that no more growth is possible, period. And that then correlates with a natural, as contrasted with arbitrary, parting of the ways. Yes?
Okay, Pluto conjunct the node in a 12th house opposed Jupiter.
The question is Pluto North Node, 12th house opposed Jupiter South Node?
But Jupiter in Capricorn.
With the node.
Yeah.
What would it have to be? What you have there is just within those symbols, eh? What you have there is a natural paradox and or conflict or opposing dynamic between emphasis placed on deductive mind, the rational, the linear, the 1 + 1 = 2 mind, and the inductive mind, which is trying to grasp the whole first, which then allows for every part to be revealed in its natural order. So there is a existential evolutionary conflict, meaning Pluto in the North Node has already been moving to develop the inductive consciousness, already been moving to shift its center of gravity from left brain to right. And yet relative to that which is coming with the soul, Jupiter South Node, there is much residual of left brain. And so what you can have is cyclic intellectual confusion. She just had a light go on, friends. So, what?
So what should she do?
What should she do is the question. Is to meditate The ultimate fear of a 12th house Pluto is losing control. And many 12th house Pluto people will never admit this. In fact, many claims to the contrary. But many 12th house Pluto people, as an example, even fear going to sleep at a subconscious level. And thus keep themselves busy, busy, busy until the point of exhaustion.
Is that why I don't sleep?
Listen to it. Proof. So, it's an ultimate fear of losing control.
So the solution would be to lose control?
There is no such thing.
There is no such thing.
So what has been afraid to be lose control here is mind. So the mind keeps engaged. And it becomes like a rat on a wheel. Hamster never shuts up. Even when you think you're not thinking, you're going to be thinking. Even when you don't want to be thinking. Which again reflects the fear. So the solution is to choose a spiritual philosophy that is self-proving, Pluto. One that will give you the conceptual framework. But say, don't believe any of this, 12th house, until you prove it to yourself. Meaning in your nature, this thing called faith must follow an experience. The only faith you should take into an experience of this kind is that the techniques, 6th house, relative to the system, Jupiter, of your choice, Pluto, just might work. It requires active meditation as contrasted with passive. Passive meditations are things like affirmations, visualizations, watching the breath, and the like. You've already realized for yourself that this is not enough. Yes. So active meditation is fundamentally different. The nature of the finite mind, 6th house, is nothing but breath, 12th house. If we look at a corpse, Pluto, I think we agree it's not thinking. Yes? And if we operate on the brain, Pluto, 6th house, 12th house, we don't find consciousness thought, and yet it exists. So active meditation by its very nature seeks to shallow the breath and then stop it. You will not only simultaneously lose your emotional fear of losing control, right then and there, because you will in that state realize that you're more conscious than ever before, and yet you're not breathing. What does it mean? But you will simultaneously sever Pluto, the tether, 6th house, of the deductive mind, 6th house, and will literally induce 12th house, an inductive consciousness, which allows the inner darkness to part, and you become experientially aware of the inner living universe. And at that point, your fundamental fear of confronting your aloneness, we're now talking about, when I look in your eye, I see a person that, in effect, is standing on a precipice. And in back of you is the light of your known world, which is now boring. And in front of you is the abyss of infinity. And you don't know how to take the plunge. So you're remaining paralyzed on the precipice and feeling more alone than ever before. So the path is not backwards, as Rob would put it, but forwards. And this means they choose a spiritual system that allows you to negotiate safely that abyss and to commit to it every single day, not waiting for yet another 6th house crisis to exist. Answer your question?
I think, okay, I also wanted to add, I've also been trying to achieve trance. Is that going to help me?
Never mind this crap called trance and this channeling bullshit. But Oh. Let me... Look, the message, 12th house Pluto, is to go directly to the source that created everything. And as Jesus pointed out, let that which you are meant to become be added onto you as a byproduct of that commitment. The delusion of the 6th house is to gather yet more techniques. You understand? As if that technique is going to do it. So, look, this thing called channeling, 90% is bullshit. What it reflects is a conditional culture that has been conditioned for 2,000 years to look for its authority outside of itself. Since Uranus has moved into Sagittarius, there has been a collective need to expand the mind. Many, many people have been accessing their own higher minds naturally. So, in a conditional culture, this equals channeling. Why? Because we've been conditioned to say our authority is outside. So rather than claiming their own self-realization, speaking from a position of self-knowledge, which this culture makes you feel guilty of, that it has to be linked with this thing called channeling to be considered credible. It's not that the thing called channeling isn't real, but it's rare. When a person truly is channeling, in quotes, a la Jane Roberts, which was true, the soul of the person is displaced. An osmosis between the higher soul and the soul takes place, Pluto. The person begins to report truths that they themselves as an egocentric entity could never realize. The heart rate changes, the pigmentation changes, the pupils in the eyes dilate, the breathing rate change, and they die early. Because it's like putting 10,000 watts through a 10-watt bulb. Boom! Now, given this case, how many real channelers do you know? And why is it that all this one's channeled message contract or conflicts this channeled message? It's history repeating itself. The cycle that we're now in was on the planet when Jesus was born. It existed when Protestant Reformation manifested. In Jesus' time, it was called false prophets. So that when the real Messiah manifested, he was judged against the current backdrop or background or context. Do you see my point? In our times, the false prophet is the channeler. As in Jesus' time, just as the Sanhedrin could use this as justification to kill, similarly, there's not now the fundamentalists using all this New Age jargon to justify their own trip. Yes or no? Thank you for coming.